Now that we've seen how to insert PHP variables into our templates, it's time to work with some more useful data. So let's take a trip to the database. While PHP and Zen4o itself, for that matter, allow you to run raw SQL queries to interface with the database, there is a more robust way to deal with the database in an application like Zen4o. Our system is called entities, and an entity represents the data for one particular item, so maybe a single user, together with all of the relations for that particular data, so maybe all the posts that a particular user has made, and any properties and useful or helper methods that go along with the data. So for example, the user entity has the ability to authenticate itself without going off and talking to some other system elsewhere. Additionally, entities are self-aware in that they can describe themselves. They have a record of how they're built up. So you could take something like the email field here and pass it to the user entity as either the value for a new entity or an updated value of an existing entity, and it will look at its structure here and say that, okay, so email is a string and it has a max length of 120, and it will automatically make sure that the data is valid in that regard. But it also knows that it has to be a valid email address, and so it'll look at a function like this verify email method here and go through and make sure that it is in fact a valid email, not a banned email, etc., etc. And if it fails the validation checks for whatever reason, it will give you an intelligent and intelligible error message rather than an abstract database failure. Together with the entity system is the Finder system, which is essentially a query builder to build up a select query, together with all of the conditions and limits and orders and other things that you'd expect when you're trying to fetch data from the database. Once you've built your query, which is done entirely programmatically rather than resorting to actually writing SQL as far as the engineer is concerned, you then have the ability to fetch the data as a collection of entities rather than flat arrays as you would find with the regular MySQL functions. This programmatic approach means that it's much easier for add-ons and other code to integrate with the Finder system because you can override functions and methods, and generally it's much easier to work with that than trying to do some sort of bizarre text manipulation on the raw SQL. So let's take a look at entities and finders in a real-world context. So here we are back in my test action for the node controller, and I've removed nearly all the code from the previous step because it's superfluous to our needs at the moment. What we're going to do here is we're going to create a user finder. So let's just get started and do that. User finder equals this finder, which is going to call a factory that will start up a finder. And then the argument that we need for the finder is the short name of the entity that we're trying to find. And in this particular case, it's XF user. We can actually see that in the user entity just here, structure short name. So back to the note controller here. Now, if I were to just let that run, and let's actually give it an output. So users equals user finder fetch. You probably saw all sorts of other stuff being suggested then. We'll go back and take a look at that in a moment. But what we're going to see here is because we've attached no conditions or limits to this finder whatsoever, the result of user finder fetch will in fact be the entirety of the user table returned as a collection of entities. So let's just stick a breakpoint in there and turn on the debugger and actually see what that looks like. So here we are, we've skipped to here. The user's variable has been initialized as the user finder fetch. So let's take a look at it. You can see it's an instance of array collection, and there are 4 entities, and there they are. You can see they're keyed with the primary key. I'm not going to dig into what the actual entity content looks like at the moment because that'll come shortly. But we can see that we do have 4 user entities as a result of this user finder. So now let's stop that and add some additional stuff. So let's just move this over here so that we can see what sort of stuff we would want. let's add a condition here. So sure enough, just as the SQL syntax would require a where, we're going to use where here too. So let's say where, and then we need to say where which field. Let's say where user ID, and then we need an operator, unless it's equals, in which case you can just omit it. Where user ID, let's say where user ID is less than 4. And we'll leave it like that. Notice that I'm just chaining onto the end of this user finder here. And we'll carry on chaining more stuff. So the output of where will go into the next condition, etc. You'll see that in a moment. Let's run that again and see what we get. So we'll hit that, and we're back in the debugger. We've stopped here again on line 21. And in the users, we've got 3 entities. And sure enough, we've got entities with primary keys 1, 2, and 3, because we didn't want anything that was 4 or above. So let's add another condition. Let's chain another one on the end there. I'm just adding them onto new lines there, but if you really wanted to do them all on one line, then you could. Now what should we do? What other stuff can we pick up? Let's say where the username contains an M. So username is like, and what are we going to use? %m% should get us what we want. So I'm expecting that will, there's an M in admin, isn't there? What should we say? Let's say where it begins with M then. So that should bring us down to 2 results if this worked properly. So run again, and the users, there are now 2 entities, so that worked as well. Now how about if we wanted to change the order that they're returned in? You can see that the order is 2, 3, so that's in user ID ascending order. Let's change that round. So let's go to the next line here and say order. Which field do we order by? Let's order by, well, let's just do something obvious and reorder them in the opposite direction. So order by user ID in descending order. Refresh, and now we should see 3, 2. So you can see that the ordering worked. Now, having said that you can chain these where commands, that's absolutely true. And what we're doing here is we're saying where this and where that. But what about if you wanted to say where this or that? Well, as it happens, that's actually quite straightforward. We're going to use a method called where or, and it looks like this. Where or, and now into the conditions here, we're going to take the arguments that would normally be put into a where clause and instead wrap them up in an array like that. And then that's the first condition. Now if we want another condition, we'll just add another array and put the conditions from this one into there. Now you can see that I'm passing each one of these arrays as a parameter, and you can carry on forever. If you were trying to call this as part of a callback and you didn't know how many parameters you were actually going to be passing, the where_all function can also wrap the whole lot up in one array like that, so that now it's just one parameter, and each parameter and each element of that first parameter is an array of conditions. That works in exactly the same way. So let's go back to the initial way of doing it. So what we're looking at here is a query that says find me all the users where the user ID is less than 4, or the username starts with M. So I'm expecting that that will actually give me 3 results this time, because the every user whose name contains an M has the ID of less than 4. There we go. So that's a quick intro to finders. Let's start to get a little bit more advanced with them now. Right now, we are just fetching the user data, and we're passing it into this fetch thing here. But sometimes you need to generate to find out how many items are going to be returned before you actually fetch them. And in normal code, that would mean running some sort of count query. And again, usually, this would mean writing another query that has all of the same conditions as your main fetching query, and but instead of fetching the various fields that you want to collect the actual data from, you'd run a count function. The Finder system makes this really easy because it can take all of the information you've passed to it here in your query builder, and it can formulate a count query rather than a select data query just with a simple method. So we can do that by just saying total equals user finder total. And now that will create for me, let's run this. Stop and run. So we've created our finder, and now we're going to get the total, and it says that the total is 3. And based on that result, you could then do pagination, or you could detect a result that's going to have no items returned at all, and then just not bother to run the fetch query. And you can make all sorts of decisions based on the number of results that you know you're going to get before you actually go to fetch them. Having seen how to fetch a collection of entities from the database, there are a few special cases where we want to fetch just one. So we could change this back into a where query, and let's get something that's going to fetch just a single record. Let's use the username. I don't know. Where username equals, now remember I said just now that that parameter is optional. I'll show you that in a second. Let's say where username equals admin, and at this point the order is irrelevant because there's only going to be one item, but what this is going to fetch is a collection of one entity, and that's not particularly useful because when to use it, we'd have to loop through it. So we can change that to a different fetching method called fetch1. And what fetch1 will do is essentially apply a limit to the query so that it knows that it's only ever going to fetch the first result returned, and hopefully that would be the only one that's of any importance, and it will return it as an entity, not a collection of entities. So let's just change that to user and go and see that in use. So debugger's on and refresh. We'll step over that, and now the user, you can see, is an entity. It's not an array collection, and we can use that user directly. Having said all that, this is a slightly long-winded way of doing that. There are various shortcuts for doing things like fetching an item with its primary ID. Like, for example, if I wanted to fetch user ID 4, then I can do that very straightforwardly by just saying where ID 4. The entity system is clever enough to know what the primary key is, so this is all you need to fetch the user with the primary key of 4. And again, this would return that user without any additional fuss. And of course, at this point, the total is irrelevant because we know that we're only going to be fetching 1. So I've taken my code back to the point where it's fetching a single entity. In this case, it's user ID with ID 2, Mr. User. And then we're going to fetch it into a single user entity. And I've done that so that we can have a look at different ways that we can actually work with the entity itself. It seems to me that a good demo to start with would be changing the email field like I mentioned earlier on in the video. So let's do that. While you're working with entities, if you're using something like PHP Storm or Visual Studio Code that understands PHPDoc, PHPDoc can be a really useful thing to employ to help your code. So I'm actually going to annotate the code at this point to tell my IDE that this user, which has come out of this XF user finder, is in fact a user entity. And I'm just going to do it like this. It's an XF entity user. And as soon as I do that, I get additional help while I'm typing code. And you'll see that when I start doing this. Let's set the email. User email. There we are. It knows that we have an email field. So we'll put that in, and user email equals, I'm going to make it throw an error to begin with. So I'm trying to set the value of user email to invalid stuff, and then I'm going to save that. and at this point I'm expecting that to fall over. So let's just turn off the debugger and see what actually happens with this. I'm expecting to get a relatively straightforward error message that tells me that the email is not valid. Please enter a valid email. Seems pretty reasonable. So let's change that to a valid email. Let's save that out, and so we're starting off with mruser@example.com. Run that, so no errors, and if I refresh the data in the database, a valid email at example.com. It is that straightforward to work with the entity system. How about if I wanted to update multiple fields? Let's change. I'm not going to recommend that you actually do this, but just for the point of the example, let's say username equals Mrs. User, and we'll change the email as well. That'll do. So we're now setting the email and the username, and then we're going to hit save, and what we should find is that, sure enough, that's all updated as we'd expect it to. So now let's change this back so that it doesn't change all my denormalized data in the database. Mr. User and Mr. User, I think it was MIS, wasn't it? Mr. User at example.com. Let's save that out. So doing updates to users is that straightforward. You can also use a thing called bulk set, which essentially allows you to pass an array of name-value pairs into a function to have them all set on the entity, and it looks something like this. You would just say user bulk set, and then you'd have your array of email would go to whatever that is, and username would be that, and essentially you just set up your name value pairs like that in order to have them all go with a single command, which is great if you've had them all come through an input filter or something like that. And you can have any number of those in that call to make that work in exactly the same way. You probably also saw that there was a bulk set ignore option there, which will bypass some of the validation checks. So only use that if you're absolutely certain that the input that you're providing is valid. So that's updating existing entities in a nutshell, but what about creating new ones? Well, as it happens, it's really quite similar. So let's just change this code around so that we're not working with an existing one, but we're creating a new one. I'll get rid of that line about the user finder, and then this part where I fetch the results of the finder I also want to get rid of. And instead I'm going to leave the PHP doc in place because we are still going to be working with a user entity. But this time I'm going to say user equals this em, which is entity manager, create, and then I need to pass it the short name of the entity type that I'm trying to create. So again, it's a XF user. And the item that returns will be essentially an empty entity, which contains all of the default information that is needed, but doesn't have the stuff that it can't work out by default. So things like the email and the username. So having created that, we then move into our bulk set or a number of individual set operations to pass the data that is necessary, and then we hit save, and that's all there is to it. The difference here being that the entity manager knows enough about the entity to know whether or not it's already represented in the database, and if it is, it'll run an update, and if not, it'll run an insert with exactly the same validation and error checking that you would expect from the update facility. So I won't actually run this now because that's not kind of the official way to create a user, and there's a user creation and registration service that actually does that job much better. But just as an example of how to create a new entity, this would essentially be it. So I'm back in the database now, and I'm looking at the post table because I want to show you a little bit about how to work with relations in entities. You'll remember that I said that entities define their own relations, and so the post entity, for example, has a relation to the user table, and it knows that the user ID in the post table relates to the user ID on the user table. And it's very easy to pick out those relations and work with them. So let's go and take a look at that in action. Back in the PHP here, I've got rid of all of that editing code, and we're going to get some fetch code again. So we'll start off with a post finder, and then we'll get the finder for xf post is the entity short name this time round. And then I'm going to only fetch those where the user ID is not 0, so not guest posts. And then I'm going to pass the posts, the post finder even, as posts to the view parameters. I've got nothing else to do with the posts in the PHP, so I'm going to be a bit lazy here and actually just pass the post finder. There's a little bit of magic that goes on here. At the point that you try to iterate the post finder in the template, it will know that in order to do that, it has to go and fetch the data first. So rather than explicitly fetching the data, which is what I do most of the time, here I'm just passing the post finder directly into the template. So let's head over to the template and do something with it. So here we are in the test page template, and let's open up that piece there and do an xf for each. The loop is on the parameter name, which is posts, and each item is going to be called post. Let's close that off, and then for each of those posts, I'm just going to echo out a little bit of information. So the let's say the post ID equals $post.post ID, and the let's be a little bit more stylish about this. Let's have a UL class equals list inline dash dash bullet. I think we'll do something that looks a bit nicer, and then we'll have individual list items inside that, and then we can take this, and this will probably work very, very badly indeed because I've probably forgotten the syntax, but hopefully it will at least be recognizable. And then we've got a user ID. Now at the moment we're only using the data that is in the actual post table. It's the basic stuff from the user table and therefore from the post table and therefore in the post entity. And I think I was going to use username, wasn't it? Username equals post.username. Now that's all great. Let's save that out and just check that it's working. And now I should expect to get a bunch of, there we go, post ID 1 was user ID 1 and admin, going right through to post ID 86, user ID 3 and Mr. Spammer. And we expended 5 queries to do that, because essentially it's the page setup plus that one query to actually fetch the posts. Now, what about if I want to get the email address for those users? Well, this is the kind of lazy way to do it, but it's a good illustration. To get a relation, all I've got to do is refer to it, post.user.email. So this tells it to use the post entity and then the user relation and then the email property of that user relation. Now this absolutely will work, but there is a caveat. And the caveat is the number of queries has gone up to 7 because we've now had to identify various different things. Now there is a little bit of magic going on. It's only 7 instead of an additional 4 queries because it already knows about the entity for admin because I'm logged in as that, and it's clever enough to know that it doesn't have to go and fetch that again. It can use the entity that is essentially my logged in user account and say, well, that's the same thing. So there we are, we've got the email addresses, but it has cost us additional queries. So how can we get around that? Well, that's easy. All we have to do is tell the post finder to bring stuff with it. So we'll say with, which relation do we want? The user relation. And now when I refresh this, we should end up with back to 5 queries again. Because essentially what we've done is we've built the join and told it that we are going to be working with the user entity, and so it's fetched it in advance with an inner or a left join, depending on how we defined the relation. Now, we're not limited to working with a single relation either. We can work with all the relations that an entity has defined, and we can chain our relations. So let's say that we want to add the thread. So let's say also with thread, because obviously a post is going to have a thread relation, and that's going to be the thread that contains it. And maybe we want to get something from another part of the user entity, though I can't think of one at the moment. So let's come back to that in a moment. But if I wanted to work with thread, then I'll just save that out, come into the template, and let's add in something to make this stand out a little bit more. We'll just have an HR, and then let's say from here, the thread, can't actually type, is $post.thread, the relation, .title. Now, this is a useful thing to note. The entity system allows you to get around that hideous problem that you often find when you're working with data that's been returned from a database in a regular system, where you don't know whether the title has come from one table or another unless you've specifically aliased it in your query. With entities, you don't have to. It automatically creates these objects and assigns the correct title to the correct thing. So, for example, the post.username here could be different from the post.user.username in some cases. But this allows you to refer to both without having any sort of name collisions. Anyway, let's come back to our thread title and just check that that does actually work. And we can see that we're now working with two complete relations. And so there we are. The thread is my first thread, and that's my first thread. And all the time, we are still only working with 5 queries. So having said that, I'd show you a chained relation. I've found that in my XF user profile table, I've got location data for my users. So let's go ahead and use that. So back in my Finder here, we've queried against posts, and we've said that we want to fetch users as well, so the user relation for the posts. But now I want something that is a relation not of the post, but of the user. How do we do that? Well, actually, it's really straightforward. We just say with user.profile. And now we have access to the user profile, again, fetched with the appropriate joins that are automatically generated. So let's save that out and refresh here just to make sure that it didn't blow up. It didn't. And then we can come in here and say, let's get rid of the user ID there. We don't need that. And we'll say that we want the location. And the location is post user profile. I think it was called location, wasn't it? Location. Let's save that. Bring it back. And here we go. There's the location. So now we're using 2 direct relations on the post table, namely user and thread, and also a chained relation where we've looked for a relation from one of the relations that belongs to the post itself. So that's a quick roundup of some of the major functionality of entities and finders when dealing with data in the database. We've seen how to fetch data, including data that is related, such as users related to posts and user profiles related to users which are related to posts, etc. And we've seen how to update existing data and insert new data. But what we need to do next is to work with a custom entity that will be tailored to our new custom data for our Notepad Scratchpad demo thingy.